Welcome to Writing in the West podcast. Our guest this week is John Glionna, an award-winning journalist who has traveled the world as a newspaper and magazine writer. He's here to discuss his new book, No Friday Night Lights, Reservation Football on the Edge of America. So you've been a journalist for decades, like you mentioned, the LA Times, New York Times, Outside. But what drew you to narrative nonfiction, and how has that changed your approach as a writer?
Uh, well, we had just talked about, I guess, before we started taping about, kind of fiction and nonfiction. And while I prefer reading nonfiction these days, and that's what my stock and trade is nonfiction, is that there are devices in nonfiction work that we owe to fiction. Character development, kind of scene description, conversation, and all of that. And I was I was a reporter at the Kansas City Star in 1986, and I was a cop reporter. So I was doing a lot of like stories, and I've always been sort of a storyteller. I'm not going to win any awards and never have it for investigative reporting, although I did one that was nominated for a Pulitzer, but billions are nominated. It's like the idea of a Pulitzer nomination is like a charge file. If it's filed, doesn't mean necessarily you're guilty. And if your Pulitzer story is nominated for a Pulitzer by your editors, doesn't mean it's any good. It's only for the finalists. But I was more of a storyteller, and I was doing a lot of police stuff, and there was a local grocery store uh, that was near my apartment in Kansas City, and it was kind of a transitional neighborhood. And in 1980s, in the mid 80s, Ronald Reagan had, in a series of budget cuts, you're too young to remember this, but what he was doing, this is pre-Trump. He was sort of like there were battles with the air traffic controllers. They went on strike, and he just replaced them all with scabs. And what he did is he cut the funding to mental health nationally. So a lot of people that were in institutions were let out and put into halfway houses. And there just happened to be a halfway house near this grocery store, which but totally changed the whole clientele of this grocery store. So I would go in to the store, and there would be all these crazy characters and all these crazy. And so I went to remember the Star at the time had a magazine, and this is the first time I'd ever written a magazine length story. And I went in and pitched the story to the editor, and he wrote a column that ran with my story about my pitch, and he said I had the nervous eyes of a basketball point guard, and I had these liverwurst buff colored terrible shoes, and I paced back in front of him saying, "Bill, you got to run this. This is a great story." And the what was the Night of the Living Dead had a movie that was pretty popular sci-fi. So this became known in the circles around the neighborhood as the Night of the Living Safeway. And there were a bunch of characters like the Moon Lady who would had sparkles in her hair, and she had her pet rabbit. She'd go around there. Buttons, the president's foreign affairs advisor, would stand outside and give President Reagan, advice. There was Safari Lady who dressed up in black safari. I mean, you name it. There were all these wonderful characters. So I dove deep, and it was the first time that I really was able to expand my writing and writing about the scenes and develop the characters. And so after I wrote that, and the story was such, uh, I had crossed into ground that people were saying, "Whoa, hey, this is pretty good." Not only was where did you find this story? And I've gotten that kind of in my career. So not only do I like to sort of dive deep, I kind of pride myself at finding stories that maybe others wouldn't find. I mean, one of the stories in the collection that's coming out, Rebels and Outliers, which I have coming out this in August, which is a compilation of stories that I wrote, front page stories for the Los Angeles Times when I was a correspondent there. There was in the early 1990s in the Mojave Desert between Las Vegas and LA, there was for some strange reason, a phone booth had been left there. It was like an old Ma Bell phone booth. And you opened the door, and it was out no, not near any road. It was just there. And what had happened is that there were mines there in the 1960s, and there was a road, and so that before cell phones, truck drivers would stop at the phone. They'd call I'm leaving. I'm leaving I got my load of ore, and I'm on my way towards you. Well, the mine closed, the road went away, but for some reason, Ma Bell never took the phone out. So it became an internet sensation, and it was known as the Mojave Desert phone booth. And so I went out and spent a day answering the phone at the Mojave Desert phone booth. And I mean, that was the kind of stuff that I went. I'll just give you one more example, and there's it's sort of like the idea of finding stuff that maybe other people wouldn't see merit in going to do, or well, and it will lead me to me going to McDermitt. The setting for my book, No Friday Night Lights, was I did a story, for example, two stories in San Francisco, one about and on Alcatraz Island, the at night after all the tourists go, there is one guy, and he's the security guard. And he has to stay on the island by himself, and he's the night watchman at Alcatraz. And he has to go. He goes up to. He's a facilities sort of security guy. And he goes through the old prison with a flashlight. And boy, we spent it was a crazy night. And then I did a story about it at San Quentin at the prison. San Quentin has a baseball team. Who would know? And populated by guys who were serving life sentences or for this or that, but they're all pretty good baseball players. So they play all home games, which is really what attracted me. So teams will come in to play San Quentin. San Quentin never comes to you. And so I went out and did a piece about the San Quentin baseball team. And so they're kind of walks on the wild side, and they're also areas where I can get that I can kind of go places where maybe others hadn't been before me. I will say that the book No Friday Night Lights, Reservation Football on the Edge of America started out as a newspaper freelance piece that I did for a small paper in Las Vegas. I had left the LA Times in 2015. I was still living in Vegas. I loved the what I call the outback of Nevada. I loved driving out there. And I found this football team, and I was doing a story about. I was looking for ways to tell the story of the isolation of the American West. And one of the things that we face here that perhaps you don't. And, I lived in Virginia as a young reporter and worked at the Norfolk, Virginia Pilot. But once I got out west, there's these great distances between places. And if you ever driven in Texas, you'll know where you're driving along and you'll see a town, and you know that it's still 100 miles away, but you can see the lights on the horizon, and it plays tricks on your mind because when you're in, when you're in North Carolina or you spend some time, when you see the lights of a town, you're there. But there's these kind of vast distances out west, and in places like Nevada that was basically formed and was settled due to mining and water, that the mines have sort of gone away in these little towns. Some of them still exist, some aren't. There's a lot of empty space between them. So I was out at a little town called Gabbs, Nevada, and their high school was a room in a larger school, elementary school, and the whole high school, grades 9 through 12, was one room with one teacher. And there were two kids who were ninth grade, one kid was in 10th. And so it was like, it was like really like, this settlement of the West where there's the old schoolhouses. And I thought, God, this is really cool. And then when I wrote that story, and the Gabbs had a basketball team, and they were named the Gabbs Tarantulas because there's an annual migration of tarantulas out near Gabbs. And there you go. I would just love to see like hundreds of tarantulas will suddenly go across the road, and people will go out looking for them, like going to Yellowstone looking for bison. And so but they didn't have enough kids to populate the team. So what they did was they introduced, and you think about it in your local school system, they had girls play on the basketball team. So it was a team that were girls and boys. It was co-ed. And they just kind of, boys don't want to play with girls. Girls were more comfortable usually in their own league, although that's changing these days. But, in that number of years ago, but the basketball team still couldn't survive, so they closed. So I had the idea. I said, gosh, I want to find a team somewhere, maybe a football team, that is so isolated and they have so few kids that what's the daily kind of regimen for the principal and the kids? And I called the superintendent of the school system who I had befriended, and Dave Jensen, and he's a good Mormon gentleman, and I told him what I was looking for, and he said, "Well, John, I think you need to call Richard Egan up in McDermitt." And so McDermitt is a little town right on the Oregon border with Nevada. It's on 95 north. It runs up from Winnemucca towards Oregon, and right at the border. In fact, the border runs right through the middle of town. And so Richard Egan is the football coach of a town, the McDermott Bulldogs high school team, and they have had struggles for a long time. And so I I called Richard, and when I called him from, I have a 415 area code on my cell phone, and Richard told me later we became famous friends, that he almost didn't pick up because who on earth would call McDermott from a 415 area code, right? I mean, he's just not used to getting calls. They're all in his local area code, and I went up and so that's where I found McDermott. But after I wrote the story, I didn't have enough. After like writing, I'd written several magazine stories, since in my time, and I didn't feel that a 1,200 word newspaper story kind of did it. I was itching for. I was like a bull that needed a little more bigger pasture. And I would call Richard and BS with him after the story. So, Coach, what's this fall look like? You going to get enough kids? Well, John, I'm out there doing what I can, and I'm going to I'm wandering around the hallways, and the kids are starting to recognize I'm looking at them to play football, and they're kind of trying to hide from me, and I'll get them, I'll get them. What are the chances this summer? Well, I'd say 75% right now. So he didn't actually talk like that. He's actually a Paiute Shoshone Indian, but he's a very I just love the guy. I didn't play high school football, but I love the idea of calling somebody and be able to say, "Hey, coach." So, so I said, Richard, why don't I come up and hang out in town and give me the. And all my friends are going, "What on earth? Why would you go there?" I mean, McDermott is two gas stations and a casino and a general store. I mean, supermarket attached to one of the gas stations. So, and I did, and the story unfolded itself in front of me. So it was sort of like it was that transition I'd made in 1986 that I realized, hey, um, this is there's a lot more freedom to roam with a magazine story, and then a book is even more freedom. And as an editor that I work with said, books are dangerous because you're swimming in some deep waters because that transition from magazine to book, it's not always easy to do in the development. You just need to pay attention to more things. So the Outback Nevada was or the No Friday Night Lights was my first traditional nonfiction book, and it I mean I love the whole the forum of writing books. In fact, I don't really solicit newspaper stories anymore just because I'm going from book project to book project now. But my fascination is still the West.
Well, in this story in particular, with No Friday Night Lights, just for those that have not read it yet, centers around the eight-man football team that, when they can field a team with enough kids on it, almost never wins. But what I realized quickly in your book was that football really is just the entry point for kind of these deeper social and cultural issues that are going on. And how did you balance that out as you were going about writing this book between the surface level of the football team and these greater social issues at play?
Well, I showed up in town in early August, and that this schedule, the Bulldogs play in, as we had discussed, an eight-man football league. So this is another manifestation of being kind of out in the middle. I don't call it the middle of nowhere. I call it the middle of somewhere because it is somewhere to those people. And so you're out there and you don't have enough kids, and so they struggle to get eight kids to come out and play every year. And some years they don't get enough kids. Some kids they don't have seasons. So the local league will say, well, we really, you can't be trusted to get enough. So if we put you on say like a 14 game schedule, and then you can't have a team. There's going to be holes in our schedule. So we're going to put you on probation, and there's going to be a four game season. So but for these kids, if they want to play, 4 games is like, four Super Bowls. So, they don't always have a team. And so when I showed up in August, I wasn't sure there was going to be a season. And, Richard had said, well, so when I got there, we about 2 weeks before Labor Day, we started having practices at night, and school hadn't started yet. And, 5 kids showed up, right? And I said, and start practicing, and there are, scenes in the book where there's, he really he needs these kids more than they need him. They want to play football, kind of, sort of. And a lot of them, there's an interesting mix of young guys from the reservation, and then there are these young sons of, like, sort of ranchers. One of them was the son of of a highway patrolman, but they all share that rural experience. And at some point, and I don't think I'm doing a spoiler in the book, that we find out pretty much, right after Labor Day, they don't have enough kids, and it's a pretty dramatic turnabout, I think, in the book, when it shows that the kids who did show up really, really do want to play football. They really do want to have that experience for their adolescence and their teenagers, that bonding. And suddenly, because of the turnabout of one freshman who wasn't sure he was going to play, they didn't have it. They didn't have a season. So it was very poignant, and I go into great depth in the book about the day they learned, um, and I can talk about that more if you're interested. But what happened is, after I called my editor back at the University of Nebraska, who I'd already they commissioned the book, and I said, we don't have a season here, but I don't think that that's going to stop me, because in the couple of weeks I was out there, I've sort of found that this is a fascinating place, and I had envisioned the book to be about high school football and a team, with the town as a backdrop, the town as a supporting character. And what I ended up with was writing about the town itself, with the football team as a manifestation of one of the ways that they were struggling with depopulation, which is happening across the American West, because people are moving, and it's been that way for a generation at least. And towns are, like, losing population. Some are really kind of closing up, rolling up they don't have sidewalks, but if they did, they'd roll them up. And because they don't have people move away. So I ended up writing about just some pretty fascinating characters. And I will say that each one told a story that you would never ever thought, that the sort of the richness of the Shakespearean tragedy of people's lives, from both coaches, Richard Egan, and if you'd like, I mean, is it okay if I go on and tell a little bit about that? But if we can move on, I mean, what I know I'm rambling here, so please,
No,
rein.
this is great. The one thing I was going to ask, especially about, being an outsider coming in not only to such a remote place like McDermitt, but also one that has that edge of, the Paiute, the Shoshone tribes, the reservations that are there. What was the process like for earning the trust of these people, and for getting really into some pretty deep issues that were going on in these people's lives?
Well, trust came slowly. I was immediately trusted by the two coaches. They were sort of, I was older than both of them, but they were almost my age, and I liked them quite a bit. One of them was a Paiute Shoshone, guy who lived in town, but he was from another nearby reservation, and he played when the team was good in the 80s and 90s. They won the state championship for their league, and so they knew they'd had winning history, winning tradition. And so he had this great history with the land itself. And the other was a white guy from Reno, who was raised by a kind of a crazy ass father named Mo, who was a professional wrestler and boxing promoter, and spent his growing years in the backseat of a car driving around to boxing matches. He became a boxer, and I love both of those guys. And when they told me that their stories, I was like, we're off and running. The kids I had a more difficult time with, and I'll explain it in a moment, with some on the reservation, and because I blame myself for one of them and not necessarily the other, but I had images of myself coming into McDermott as kind of this hipster, obvious, admittedly liberal, big city journalist, and all the kids would be like, "Hey, wow, so what's it like to, live in the big city?" Because we were like totally on different sides of the cultural spectrum. But there was less curiosity on their behalf as me, and I would talk to these guys, and it was difficult for me to get them to open up to me in some regard, and they were very, kind of the cliquish with each other, and the res kids hung out, but with themselves, and the rancher kids in some way. And I remember coming to Richard one day and saying, "How can I break this?" He goes, "No, it's just got to be yourself. They're kids. Don't, I was sweating. If you really want someone to like you, chances are you're going to be not yourself." And I remember, excuse me, I remember one day there was a young one of the young players who was who was the best running back, and I use pseudonyms for these boys, but his he I cornered him because it was very difficult after practice. They'd be in the locker room, they were together, very difficult to get them alone and say, "Hey, can we talk? Can I buy a cup of coffee?" So I asked him if I could come by his house, and he goes, "Yeah, sure." So I drove onto the res, and it was a Saturday afternoon or Friday afternoon, I can't recall, and he was outside, and very difficult to find, by the way, no addresses. And so he ended up having to come out on the road and wave me down because I was just totally lost. It's a pretty big reservation. And we sat outside on his front stoop because he said his parents didn't really allow strangers in the house. And I totally got that. But that's what I was. I was a guy, I was a foreigner, and I was white. I was from not from town. And my politics were completely opposite from most of the people on the reservation. But once we started talking, it was really fascinating, where he really opened up with me. And at one point, I just asked him straight out. I mean, if you imagine, like, do you have kids?
Yes.
I don't. So here, it's a totally, how old are your kids? Can I ask? I hope I'm not, are they
All
teenagers?
under five.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. Well, you'll get to where we're going, but at some point, somebody's 17 years old, and I asked him, I gave it a pregnant pause for my question, but I said, "Are you a virgin?" Because I just wanted to know that was to me, I know how important it was to me when I was growing up. And he admitted, he was, and he talked about how difficult it was to sort of let nature take its course in such an isolated area, especially on a reservation where a lot of people are related. And he had gone to a Future Farmers of America meeting in Reno, and he met a girl from another reservation, and they started texting, and he just recognized the last name. There's only so many last names on the reservation, and he asked his grandmother, and she said, "Oh yeah, yeah, she's a she's a cousin of yours, right?" So he stopped, and he didn't want to go there at all. And his father was saying, "Listen, your mom's my cousin, it doesn't matter." But he goes, "No, no, no, I'm waiting. Waiting for myself till I get out to the real world." So you're going places where everyone is related. So there is that interconnectivity, and there is a collective listening ear on the reservation where everybody kind of knows what you're doing. And in answer to your question about, I was, until I left, I was in some circles, uh, somebody that people didn't trust. And at one point, I wrote, when I was in McDermott, my schedule, the way I would do it, I was trying to drum up some interest in the book. I have a website. I write a blog, and I was writing sort of like, I think I was calling it, Days in McDermott or something. And I would go to practice at night, and I would come home, and rather than file away my notes saying, "Oh, I'll get to this in January when I sit down to write the book," I was writing in real time. And I was going down, and I was writing like, "Hey, I'm writing a column for a newspaper, and I'm writing it just like it was going to be ready for print." And I would write this stuff. And when I was done, I would post it online. And at one point, early on in the the practices, the coaches were sitting there. They still had five guys, maybe six. They never got eight, and they said, "Well, at least we don't have the twins here." And I go, who are the twins? Oh, they're a couple of res kids that came up here last year, Billy and Joe. And he said they were just, he said, I thought they were developmentally disabled because they wouldn't tackle. In fact, in games, they would like step aside if a running back was coming by them, and so I wrote about them, and I mentioned that there were the coaches were saying at least Jimmy and Joe weren't there, the two developmentally disabled kids from the reservation. The day after I posted that, within hours after I posted it, I just sort of my email lit up, and people were on the reservation. Silly me to think that I was just writing for people out there in San Francisco. My readership, a lot of it were right. People knew I was in town, and so. I got a call from a an activist actually who was there was at the time I was there. There is a new lithium mine that's being opened up Thacker Pass nearby, and this part of the book and how it's very controversial out there. And I went out and met one of the activists who was an outsider like me, but had known a lot of the people on the reservation. And he said, "Hey man, you got some problems here because the mother of these two kids wrote to me and she's just livid." It's like, uh-oh. And so it ended up, I ended up having to sort of go, and the principal, kind of got involved, and she was thinking of actually banning me from. She had said that I had broken. I had to sign a document, and that I had broken. I had exposed the identities of kids, and so I went back to the superintendent of schools and went amok, and nearby Dave Jensen went in to visit him. He goes, yeah, you kind of stepped in it out there because you realize you're writing for a very hyper vigilant, rural community, not used to outsiders. And I don't think you've broken any. Nobody here knows who Billy and Joe are. Everybody there does. They know it anyway. But nobody outside the town does. So I wasn't kicked off campus per se, but I was, and the principal called me in and really kind of gave me kind of and she was an interesting woman, but she was, protective of those kids. And I was on a Saturday, like Little League football game, and I was standing next to one of the coaches, and all of a sudden somebody was right in my ear, and she startled me. And what she said was, "Keep my kids out of your bullshit stories." And whoa, and I turned around, and I said, and the mother of the two twins was Doreen. And I said, "I'm sorry, I had met Doreen." I go, "Are you Doreen?" She goes, "No." And she went over and she was just smoldering, looking at me, and she was talking to people and pointing at me. And I don't like people in my grill. I mean, not that I grew up in rough neighborhoods, but I'm thinking, you're like, "Hey man, you got to back off here because you created this little fire." And so even after that, there were two other sisters that worked in a local general store, and they wouldn't wait on me. And one of them, I would, they glared at me every time I passed. And at the last week I was in town, I saw one in the Say When, which is it was a casino bar, and people went there to eat and have beers. And I saw her in she was playing one of on one of the slot machines, and I walked up to her. I said, "Well, I'm leaving." She turns around. She goes, "Why are you even saying this to me?" And I said, "Well, I just wanted, one more chance to apologize." She said, "Apology not accepted. So get out of my face," and turned around. Now, I'm never going to win her over, but I did win over others. And I approached people on the reservation, that were a father who was really kind of a struggling drug addict who had played football, and his son was playing and his daughter was playing, and he wanted to be a good example. He was actually a coach on the team. And when I approached him, he said, "The elders told me not to talk to you." He said, "But people make mistakes, and I'm gonna give you a second chance." And we became good friends. And there was three other women that I wanted to get into the whole concept of the matriarchy that is the reservation culture, where women are really strong figures. I don't like a lot of cultures. And there were three. There was a grandmother, a daughter, and a granddaughter, and they were all really interesting women. And I got together and spoke to all of them, and they were reticent at first, but now we're all pretty good friends. So I lit a brush fire of my own making, and then kind of I had to go put it out around town. But in the end, I think that the people who liked me more, and the people who were not going to give me a chance probably never will. And I did a little research about, my book is it's a derivative title. The book, original title of the probably the most famous book about high school football is Friday Night Lights by Buzz. I can't think of what's his last name, Bissell, I think. And I read about him, and he was not exactly he didn't get along with the football either. So the lesson when you go into any kind of subculture as an outsider, you try your best to fit in, but you're not always going to be one of them. You're always going to be that outsider, and that's really quite what I learned. But I've gone back to McDermott since, and I love the place. I love the people.
And you've spent so much time there. You dedicated a lot of your professional career so far to getting this book out and everything since. And you know, why is it important to tell these stories? Especially of these places that no one in America might ever have on a map to go visit.
Well, I think I'll answer that, with kind of 2 points I'd like to make. It's like the way I likened my time in McDermott was if you're driving down a country road, you're from the city, and say you get an impulse and you get off the freeway and you drive into town, you're on a country road with cornfields on either side, and you're motoring down. And if you stop and turn your car off and let the engine, kind of stop its, rattle and hum, and it's totally quiet, and just stop and listen, you're going to hear and see things out in that cornfield. You're going to see crows coming up. You're going to see predatory birds. You might see a fox. And if you things you wouldn't see by going by at 40, 50 miles an hour, just cornfields, anonymous. That's what my stop in McDermott was. If you stop long enough in these supposedly isolated places and wait for, sort of the population to come out and either embrace you or reject you, there, you're going to realize there's a lot of interesting stories to be told in these places where, they might not have, they only have two gas stations, but, they have a really kind of interesting story to tell. And I think it's really important, especially today, when Donald Trump was elected for a second term, a lot of, I live in probably one of the nation's most liberal areas, in San Francisco. And a lot of people in my silo were saying, "Oh God, I don't trust you. Whoever, I can't even talk to somebody who would vote for Donald Trump." It just so happens my wife is Chinese and she's a Trump voter, so I'm very used to dealing with, like, I know what's going out there in America. We have discussions about different views, but going to places like McDermott, I know that it's a red part of the country, it's a red part of the state, and you can't dismiss people as two-dimensional cardboard characters who pull a voting, who vote one way, so thereafter you have nothing in common, you have nothing to say. I would say that 95% of the people I met were all, Trump supporting, Republicans, but some of them are some of the most colorful characters and they're good friends of mine. And so I have kind of breached the divide. All it does is take a little time to go out and turn your car off in the cornfield and listen. And so I think I don't make snap judgments about, people either, like if I'm not going from either Appalachia or from, rural North Carolina or Virginia, all these places. Oh, I wouldn't have anything to say to them. We would have a conversation. I mean, could we? It depends if people will put their guard down. But if they can, there is dialogue to be had in America today. And I think that's what's an important reason about, urban guy goes to rural area, writing about football, but he comes back with stories about kind of the whole human condition.
Well, what I really liked about your book too was, in traditional books about the West, we lionize the myth of the rugged individual, the
Mhm.
man or the woman that can stand on their own against all foes and nature and what have you. But, in your book, it really brings to the forefront, the interdependence of these communities and how really tied in people are to each other and they rely on each other, being so far away and so remote. You know, was that intentional for you? And, what has that helped you understand more about the places like McDermott?
Well, you're right. There is a sort of, we mythologize the West, a bunch of Daniel Boone characters that are living, and they're there. Believe me. I mean, they're there. The people that if there was Armageddon, and when the dust cleared, there'd be smokes coming from several houses out near McDermitt. People would survive it and would be doing just fine. But for the most part, you know, they're part of a culture, they're part of a society. They want it both ways. I remember I asked my landlord, who was a very interesting woman, and you know, about why she would live where she lived and why live here. It's really difficult. I mean, and maybe in your neck of the woods, so to speak, you have to drive distances, but in McDermott, to go to a grocery store is 75 miles, and go to a doctor. There's no services there. Go to a doctor, go anywhere. And I became part of the weekly, sort of migration south to the Walmart in Winnemucca, and I would see some of my neighbors there. For me, it was good because I didn't get out of town during the week. I was like, I'm stretching my legs. I'm getting to see other places in McDermott. And so there is that umbilical cord that they realize is there, and they rely on it. And there's many still are getting government paychecks. They still have to, if they have ranchers, they still have to sell their product on the market, to survive. And so they just want to they want to be part of the American experience, but as a friend of mine once said, they just want a little more elbow room. And so, they it's nice to live. They don't want to live in a tract neighborhood. They want to live it where you got at least 5 acres. I mean, that's just stuff for starters. And so and a lot of there I don't think a lot of them are on the run from you get a lot of kind of cliches that there are people who are ready for the next revolution. And I'm heading up to Idaho on for a road trip, and everybody I tell also says, oh yeah, you're run into the that crowd. And it's like you don't really find, at least I didn't in my travels, I didn't find people were there because they distrusted those who are outsiders. They weren't used to them. And they wanted, it was really driven more like what they wanted in life and how they were going to provide it for themselves. Real life. And I sort of buried my story. I mean, my landlord was saying, she goes, I just like to see the moon come up at night. And I like to be out and, take, one of the coaches he had 13 cats. And he was a cat guy. And so the cats prowled around, around, and he had, a couple acres of property. And so it's what they're pursuing more than what they're sort of trying to avoid or running against. These aren't sort of like there's no walls around McDermott and with guns facing you come in. They're just people who are going about their business, and they're surprised that you even stopped.
What has the response been like from the community since the book was published?
Well, it's funny. It's in the library, and I'll be totally honest with you. It's in the library. There's a couple copies, and I've called up. I was going, I was gonna go up and have a reading in McDermott, but both of the coaches warned me against it because we never knew if I was going to get heckled, and it would have been really uncomfortable. And I blame myself. This is more about me than it does about McDermott. Where there is the community center, and there was a former coach who was a coach during the 1990s, and he was part of my book. And after interviews with him and some others, they got together, and now there's an annual where they do like a Hall of Fame for McDermott's athletes, and they give awards. And he said, why don't you come out with your book, next award thing we could talk about. And I thought, I just, scaredy cat me. I haven't been back. And I think that I was trying to get some book readings in Winnemucca and in nearby. And here's another thing, perhaps sadly, about, the rural West of rural America, ain't many bookstores out there.
Yeah.
So, but to answer your question, I hightailed it from some, but I'm friends with, I've embraced McDermott in a very large way, and much of McDermott's embraced me. But I would say there's a couple people that probably were glad I left.
Well, and I know you have a new book set to come out as well. Could you talk for a second about that and
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
what
Thank you.
that process was like as well?
Well, I was I mentioned earlier, I was for years I was a rover. For a rover is a sort of reporter who just goes out and finds interesting stories out in the ether. And I covered any stories I could find in the west of the Mississippi. And I wrote about a lot of interesting characters. So these are a collection of about 30 stories that I wrote, some magazine pieces, some are newspaper stories, and they're all about that whole kind of Western idea of you might not be Daniel Boone, but a lot of you out there are rebels, and a lot of you are outliers by definition. So that's the title of the book, Rebels and Outliers: Real Stories of the American West. And I write about, as a foreword, I write about my search for finding good narrative stories to tell out there, and how to find stories that other reporters don't necessarily find, and my attraction to them. So I'm hoping that I will connect with readers on this, and so far pre-sales are pretty good.
Perfect. And what is the release date on that, John?
I'm sorry.
What's the release date for that one?
Oh, August 12th.
Okay, perfect.
August 12th, yeah. And it's called Rebels and Outliers: Real Stories of the American West. It's on pre-sale. You can get it on Amazon.
And in the meantime, any listeners can be sure to pick up No Friday Night Lights, Reservation Football on the Edge of America, to whet their appetite for the West until August 12th.
There
Well,
you
John,
go.
thank you so much for your time. We've
Thank you,
appreciated
Tyler.
everything today, and we'll have to have you back on once I can get through the next one.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope what I've said is and just remember, people out there that are it's writers sometimes are as they're it's the business of making enemies and losing friends, but the friends that you make, you keep.